Respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Shetye, Registrar, Professor Kamath, respected teachers, fellow students, and friends, it's indeed a great honor to be with you today on occasion of your 29th Foundation Day. And it's indeed an honor to be able to talk about scenarios for Goa for the next 100 years. And I'm sure that all of us who love Goa deeply are really worried about what is the Goa that we will leave behind for our children and our children's children over the next 100 years. And therefore, I think it is important to ponder about scenarios for Goa for the next 100 years. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to actually deviate from what I normally do. I normally like to talk extempore. But what I have done for you is, because this topic requires a lot of careful thinking, I have actually crafted out a pre-prepared speech, and I will read it out to you as well as talk to you in between. It's important for me to first clarify my purpose. It's not my purpose here to actually deliver to you scenarios for the next 100 years of Goa. Rather, it is my case to worry about the absence of scenarios stretching beyond the here and now. There's an absolute absence of such scenarios. It is my case to worry about the lack of any serious discussion, debate, to look at alternate futures beyond the present. It is my case to worry about the absence of focus and capacity to designing the future. We just don't have a way whereby we are building capacity to design the future. We are content with the future that is just happening onto us. Our designs, if any, lack not just the time axis, but also the idea of dynamics, change, and life. It is my focus to worry about the increasingly complex systems of Goa in an ever-complex world that we are a part of. It is my case to worry about our failing to assume leadership of the future. So many of us grow up learning to create realities first by imagining them, by first experiencing them in our minds. We are all familiar with George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, where he transformed a princess from a flower girl. Be careful what you think, warn the sages, for it may turn out to become real. The future then is not predetermined or unalterable. The future is what we make it out to be. Scenarios are alternate possible sequence of future events. Scenarios remind us that the future is not fixed. It's not a single path, but it's rather what we choose from the choices that we make. Scenarios remind us that there are many alternate futures that are possible. Scenarios remind us that the choices we make, the decisions that we endorse, the goals that we arrive at, the indicators of events that drive us to action, the missions that we pursue, the relationships that we live in, the communities that we build, the purposes that we live for, and the visions that we aspire for shape our future. Scenarios are not predictions. They do not condemn a community to their fate. Rather, they liberate communities to understand the alternates between the utopia, the wonderful future that we could create, and the dystopia, the terrible futures that we could possibly unleash, that may emerge as a consequence of our actions. Scenarios are not like the legendary predictions of the beautiful Cassandra, the Greek priestess, accurate yet unbelievable. So, if you don't know of Cassandra, Cassandra was a priestess in Troy, in the temple of Apollo, And Apollo, the Greek god, had the uncanny habit of turning up at his temples and blessing people who happened to be there. So he turned up at this Greek temple, at this temple where Cassandra was a priestess, and he was stunned to see the beauty of Cassandra. So he asked her for a kiss, and in return he said he would give her a boon. And that boon, he said, would be your ability to foresee and prophesize the future. So when he actually kissed Cassandra, Cassandra saw the future where Apollo was going to be helping the Trojans with the horse to actually go into Troy and capture it. And she was so disturbed and annoyed that she actually spat on Apollo. And Apollo by now had given her this great gift of looking at the future, and he couldn't take it back. So instead he said that, well, you will be able to see the future accurately, but nobody will believe you. Nobody will believe you. So that was the curse of the blessing that he cast upon Cassandra. So Cassandra's futures have always been ones which were accurate, but nobody believed her. So scenarios are not like Cassandra's, gift. They are actually not daydreams or castles built in the air. They may not be accurate, but they are very believable options or outcomes that we might experience in the future. Most scenarios are believable alternates based on models and perceptions of those who create these scenarios. So good scenarios are based on our understanding of systems that drive the change, the systems that we are a part of. We live in many, many systems around us. And while many of us who come from the physical or life sciences are familiar with what systems are, often at times we forget that we are also part of so many social and management systems. And the way in which these systems organize themselves actually drives the change that happens and the future that is created. So scenarios which are based on understanding of these systems are very real, very plausible, and what can happen as a consequence of the choices we make in these systems. So these scenarios, good scenarios, offer insights into not just the behavior of these systems, but also the counterintuitive behavior of these systems. More importantly, the counterintuitive behavior, because most of the times, students of systems have observed that social and management systems, and in fact many complex systems, exhibit counterintuitive behaviors. They don't actually show behavior which you can expect intuitively. They often work exactly opposite of what you imagine they would work as, or they behave in ways which are very strange and counterintuitive. So scenarios which are based on an understanding of these counterintuitive behaviors make a lot of sense. Some scenarios are based on formal models which can be simulated on computers, as was the great World 3 model way back in the 70s in the MIT Sloan School for the Club of Rome. There was a team of modelers led by Professor Jay Forrester, Donella Meadows, and Dennis Meadows, which actually created a world model which looked at the way in which the world will proceed if business as usual continued, and what would be the fate of the world environment, the world economy, and the world energy scenario. So way back in 1970, they came up with the notion, or they came up with alternate scenarios. And the most likely scenario, they said, was that we will have an overshoot and collapse. And they call this as actually the limits to growth for mankind and human society. This has since become extremely famous, and in fact, the limits to growth and the work that stood to make the limits to growth has found its way into the mainstream of the curriculum of universities across the world. Although in the 1970s, it was something which was almost rejected as being appalling, and how can there ever be limits to growth? So the importance of creating these scenarios is extremely important because the foundations for the whole theory of sustainable development comes from the work of J. Forrester, Donella Meadows, and Dennis Meadows, making this model and creating scenarios of the world if growth were to continue the way it was continuing way back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So other scenarios are based on analysis of data. Some scenarios address important immediate choices and their consequences, and others, all the choices that affect the purposes and visions of the communities. Good scenarios provide opportunities to examine the question and question our mental models about the complex systems that we are a part of. They provide us opportunities to navigate our way into creating livable and even enjoyable futures. Scenarios are invaluable when they form a basis of public discourse on the future of communities. They help identify the scenarios that are the dystopias or utopias to different stakeholders in the community. What can be a utopia for some part of the community can well be a dystopia for others. And therefore, it is important that scenarios become part of a public discourse, that we debate and discuss what alternatives exist for the path of development that we choose. They provide presense to the pains and pleasures each scenario promises to inflict upon the stakeholders of the future. Scenarios provide tremendous value in helping each person to recognize the impact of the choices they make, the decisions they endorse, the goals they set, the indicators they use to drive action, the missions they choose, the purposes they want to live for, and the visions they aspire to realize. They create a community well-being through alignment of action, continuity in choices across political regimes, sharing of visions, and respect for diverse purposes that different people within the community may have. While the scenario for a Nasiruddin who sits on a branch and cuts the branch that he is sitting on might be very simple, it's much more complex to actually model Apollo 13, which ran out of power, to find out what instruments must be turned off or on in order to get Apollo back onto Earth safely. The scenario for a spaceship Goa are even more complex. And I would like to, for a moment, for you to think of Goa as a spaceship. So what do you need to do when you think of a spaceship? You have a contained vehicle which is transporting a number of beings into time and space. And in order to make sure that this is livable, there are a whole lot of things which have to be there in the design of the spaceship. The role of the pilot of the spaceship is quite different from the role of the designer of the spaceship. When we look at our states, when we look at our country, we rarely think about who is the designer of the spaceship that we are traveling in. We look at ourselves as basically the pilots and not the designers. And therefore, the choices that we make are restricted to what are imposed on us by whoever designed the state and the country. Stuart Brand, who is the president of the Long Now Foundation, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Long Now Foundation shortly, says that now is the period of time when people feel, they live, act, and have responsibility. For most of us, now is about a day, maybe a week. Sometimes it can be a year. For some traditional tribes in American Northeast and Australia, now is 7 generations back and forward, which is almost 350 years. We live in a fast world where companies are increasingly shorter-lived. Enormous buildings come and go. Scams are forgotten faster than new ones crop up. Relationships last only long as interests last. Political regimes appear and vanish in months. Careers rise and crash in weeks. Our governments are limited to next election thinking, and our corporations about next quarter perspectives. As we come closer to a 2020 or a 2035, even our future shrinks a year at a time. Our now is increasingly becoming shorter and shorter. In our information age, we look for excitement, fast, my term kind of solutions. I am in office for the next 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, and in my term, what can I do? Current, temporary. British musician and artist Brian Eno highlights that you rarely get the feeling that anyone has the time to think 2 years ahead, let alone 10 or 100. He points out that such a world may be undeniably lively, but the downside was that it seems selfish, irresponsible, and randomly dangerous. He came to think of this as the short now and suggested the possibility of the opposite, which is the long now. So in the United States, there is a foundation called as the Long Now Foundation. And this foundation has now existed for at least 2 decades, and they run a couple of very interesting activities. One of their activities actually run what has come to be called as the Seminars on Long-Term Thinking, or SALT, where they basically focus on the long now, which is not 100 years, but which is actually 10,000 years. So the idea behind this is actually to jar people into thinking beyond their lifetimes. Can we actually shock people to think beyond not just the lifetimes of our children or our grandchildren, but perhaps to think about the lifetime of perhaps the human race? Is it going to survive past 10,000 years, or is it going to become extinct? And to really think about issues, the choices that we make today that would affect over 10,000 years. Another very interesting project that the Long Now Foundation is undertaking is to construct monuments and rituals which would help us to realize that the passing year or our passing life is but a mere speck in the ocean of time. So they have, amongst their projects, constructed a clock which will stand as a monument in the desert in America, which will capture time in such a way that in everybody's living today, in their lifetime, it will tick only once. So it will actually capture the tick of a generation. Contrast this with the watches that we wear, which tick every second. So what is this watch which can actually shock us into realizing that this is the long now that we need to think of? So in Goa, the change of governments, the faster change in policies, the impacts of the stay on mining, the tourist flows, the price of petrol, the availability of parking space, the fish and vegetable prices occupy our short now. Understandably, we pay most attention to the fast-changing elements. As Brian Eno asks, can we become inspired by the prospect of contributing to the future? Can we shame ourselves into thinking that we really owe those who follow some sort of consideration? Just as the people of the 19th century shamed themselves out of slavery. So perhaps in the entire human race, an entire generation which probably looked beyond their own convenience and their own lifetimes, is the generation which decided to abolish slavery and change their life and the lives of people beyond them, generations beyond them forever. Can we extend our empathy to lives beyond ours? Can we look at the lifetime of the child born now? Can we look at the transformations that matter over the next 1,000 years, or at least the next 100 years of Goa? In 2000, I was part of a team that looked at 100-year scenarios for Greater Panjim. Greater Panjim was essentially mostly on the south side of Mandavi, stretching up to Ribandar and into Merces and the Bambolim Plateau. Our mandate was to look at renewable energy, particular gas, as a transition fuel as the world moves to renewables from an oil-based economy over the next 100 years. I think most of you will be aware that we are well past peak oil, or the maximum rate at which oil can be produced across the world, somewhere in 2005. So which basically means that the rate at which we can deliver oil to the world will only be less and less in the future. However, the demand for oil or the demand for energy is only going to be more and more. So if you were to really look at meeting the demand for energy, there is going to be need to shift to alternates for oil. And one of the great beliefs that gas companies and those who believe that in the abundance of the gas reserves in the world have is that gas might play a big role as a transition fuel to allow us to make transition from oil to renewable energy, solar and wind and geothermal and whatever else there may be. So I developed a model that looked at the dynamics of the demographic systems to explore scenarios and resources and waste management for this region. We won an international award for the work. 12 years later, we are in an ever more complex world. Our leadership has no models of the state or the country they attempt to transform. They have no scenarios to share other than an assurance of a single fixed, unchangeable future. Besides the leap of faith, there is little to believe that the choices that we make, the decisions that we endorse, the goals that we arrive at, the indicators and events that drive us to action, the missions that we pursue, the relationships that we live in, the communities that we build, the purposes we live for, will yield the visions we aspire for or shape the futures for the better. If alternate possibilities are not recognized, understood, or designed, there is no way we can address them. It is therefore no wonder that the absence of these scenarios result in what I call as a design failure of governance. It's a failure of the design itself. If we look back at the last 2 years, I think we have seen a lot of governance failures across India. The 2G scam, the Colgate, the Commonwealth Games scam, the Adarsh scam, these are all indications of the failure of governance. So these are indicators that actually it's a design failure. Despite the fact that we have a design on how to govern the country, we have had such colossal and massive scams or massive failures of governance, design failures of governance which have happened. So with the huge failure of governance across the country, there is a crying need for dynamic models of our systems and scenarios for the entire country and also for each state, including Goa. In fact, in Goa, the state government has over 80 departments. Each department undertakes its business based on the rules which are framed under the acts under which these departments come into existence or for which these departments are responsible for. So no department has even a single scenario of the consequences of the rules or the policies that they follow. Not for the short now, and certainly not for the long now. So unless such scenarios are created and used to design the future of Goa will just come upon us through the sheer momentum of the here and now. Whatever is happening today is what is going to drive the tomorrow. There is no design. There is no path. There is no alternate scenario. Nobody is thinking about there can be an alternate future. And what can the alternate future look like? What can a utopia look like? What can a dystopia look like? It's not just the utopias that we need to look at. We also need to look at the dystopias because we need to avoid them. When you design an automobile, when you design an airplane, when you design a bridge, you look at the design parameters. You look at what is it that is going to allow this to function under the conditions in which it will exist. But when we design a state, when we design a country, or when we design, a department or a ministry, we don't think about what are the conditions under which it is going to exist and how can it actually deliver what is expected of it under those conditions. So imagine looking at tourism policies without any systems models or scenarios over the next 100 years at least. Imagine the irresponsibility of decisions on environment, forestry, and ecology of the state without any systems models to look at alternate policies. Imagine the transformation of Goa into an urban slum because no one projected alternate scenarios for land use and protection of various land uses within the state. I think it was mentioned earlier that Goa is fast becoming an urban slum. And if we were not to look at alternate scenarios, this is certainly the reality that we will bring on to ourselves. So, unfortunately, in Goa is doing exactly what all other states in India are doing. So those who run the government are like pilots navigating the airplane that someone else designed. For designing the future, we need designers of governance and policy. That is where scenarios over the long now are important. It is these scenarios that will ensure that spacecraft Goa remains airworthy and can take its passengers on adventures that they love. Unfortunately, most of the people in government remain pilots and shy away from design. The many things on which our future well-being and prosperity depend are in jeopardy. The beauty of Goa, the resilience and productivity of its systems, its culture, the attitude of its people, its biological diversity, and its climatic stability. Just a few years ago, nobody ever imagined a mine-free Goa. I think most of us would have been ridiculed if 5 years ago we had said Goa is going to close down its mines. Today, this scenario could be a reality, and certainly over the next 100 years, that is a very highly probable scenario, or probably a very real scenario. The scenarios that result from the dynamics of land use can not only help recognize the choices necessary to create sustainable state, they can help to deal with the causes of dystopian urbanization that seem to plague Goa as much as in other states. What alternates exist for the apartmentization of Goa's landscape? Are there any scenarios that will identify ways to prevent the creation of urban slums in Goa? Are there any scenarios that will leave the architectural and space identity of Goa for those who live 100 years hence? Or will they see no different from the slum cities of the neighboring Maharashtra? What choices will preserve Goa from being sold off to speculators? What choices will preserve the true value of Goa, its lifestyle, its culture, and the warm and peace-loving attitude of its people? The scenarios that result from the dynamics of global climate change can help plan for a possible Isles of Goa as sea level rises by 0.8 to 2 meters by 2100 over the next 100 years. What choices are necessary to ensure that those in coastal areas do not become displaced or homeless? what will be the implications on beach tourism in Goa? The scenarios that result from the dynamics of fisheries and agriculture can help choices that would ensure overexploitation or pollution do not destroy these sectors. Will the commissioning of the Jaitapur nuclear power plant destroy the fisheries of Goa? Or will the distant Fukushima, the waters of Fukushima through ocean currents, have reportedly transported nuclear waste thousands of miles across in the seas and oceans of the world? Will the dumping of waste into the seas serve to poison that what we feed on? Or will overexploitation, mechanization, and international fishing kill it first? The idea of managing renewable resources which are exploited, like fisheries, rests on understanding the phenomena of exponential growth and the ability of the fish population to regenerate. And unless scenarios of whether it is the fishing boats and the fishing mechanisms which grow faster than the fish populations are actually explored and understood, and based on which governance mechanisms are formulated, we will almost certainly find that we do not leave fisheries 100 years hence. Just as the Brazilians destroyed the Peruvians destroyed the Peruvian anchovy fish or the Peruvian anchovy fisheries in their waters, we might end up destroying the fisheries on our coasts. The tourism scenarios of Goa can help Goa ensure that 100 years from now, Goa will not become the crime tourism capital. Will we offer tourists a drug haven, a sex haven, or a gambling and money laundering haven? Or will we look at building pilgrimage tourism? Perhaps even educational tourism for corporates, or research and development tourism for global innovation. What choices need to be made in order to ensure that Goa becomes the preferred conference destination for not just India, but the rest of the world? The scenarios resulting from industrial dynamics of Goa can provide insight into the choices that result into utopias and dystopias. Should Goa have an industrial estate in every constituency? There are so many industrial estates across Goa. Or should they all be consolidated into one location over the long now? What implication will this have on mobility, urbanization, and resource availability in Goa? The scenarios resulting from demographic dynamics can help Goa design ways to increase knowledge worker density and transition from a mere 0.57 workers being university educated to deal with the declining workforce as the population of Goa ages. I don't know how many of you have looked at the demography of Goa, but if you look at the way in which the age structure of Goa is today, the population of Goa over the next 30 years is going to be top heavy, which means there are going to be more elderly people in Goa than youth, as the people who are young now actually age. And so unless there is some strategy made in order to deal with this scenario, you might actually find that there are less workers to do the work in Goa. As a consequence, it can result in the need for a huge amount of influx of people in order to undertake the tasks to maintain Goa as livable. So scenarios to look at what can we do to address the basic way in which the age structure exists. It's a demographic reality for Goa. And we need to look at how are we going to handle this and what choices will result in scenarios where we retain our cultural values. And what are these cultural values that we would like to preserve? How will we ensure the education of those who happen to be there at that point of time? And what education would we want to impart to people who are going to build the next 100 years? What are the scenarios that would build resilience for Goa's food supply? Will Goans in the long now pay at least 50% of their earnings for food as the declining supply causes future speculators to invest in retail? So various scenarios need to be explored in terms of what will happen as Goa's indigenous food supply, which has traditionally been very short, dwindles as time goes along and as land use changes, and as policies within the state cause this supply to go much shorter than the demand, causing it to be extremely profitable to invest in and speculate in retail or speculate in commodity markets in the food area. And this is something which is happening across many countries in the world, where because of speculation, commodity market speculation in food, you find that prices have gone up astronomically in many countries, so much so that people have to shell out not 10% of their earnings, but almost 40 to 50% of their earnings for their food needs. What will be the water supply of Goa? Will it be resilient to the supply shocks or to the pollution that it will be subject to? What investments must Goa make to ensure its energy independence in the long now? The scenarios that result from ecological dynamics can help Goa design ways to preserve the biodiversity, ensure clean environment, and maintain a healthy biogeochemical cycles. Will Goa succeed in leaving the legacy of the Western Ghats or the mangroves? Will its rivers and streams flow free? Will its unique khazans continue to yield paddy 100 years from now? These are not easy questions. They are undeniably important ones. They need to be part of our study, our research, our discussion, our dialogue for the long now. During his tenure as the President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter commissioned Dr. Gerald Barney to go across to the various departments in the US administration and find out what were the assumptions and models that these departments used in order to create their policies. The resulting effort helped bring out the diverse assumptions and the huge gap in understanding that existed about the impact of the choices each department had on USA and the world. In fact, even the inconsistencies of the assumptions that different departments had about the same country came into the limelight. They became visible. As a consequence, they also discovered that there were no scenarios being projected by various departments within the US administration. As I said earlier, each department in the Goa government must shoulder the responsibility for developing systems models that yield diverse scenarios. These need to form the basis for governance and policy designs for Goa in the long now. A university is the fountainhead of wisdom. It is the fountainhead of wisdom for the civilization that it supports. Its responsibility in building the capacity to create future designers is today more important than it ever was. It's more important to create those who will pilot the designs, those who will design more than those who will pilot those designs. It needs to establish a course in every faculty on future design to help each faculty to build the capacity of their students to understand the impacts of the existing designs of their domains and the variety of ways to alter them. If you look at the state that we are in today, not just in Goa, but across India and across the world, it's basically people who are the graduates and postgraduates and PhDs from universities across our country as well as elsewhere, are the ones who have been piloting the systems that seem to have caused the scenarios that we live in. So obviously, our universities across the world have not yet taught them how to be designers of these systems. We have focused on building people who are good pilots, who can navigate a vehicle, but have we taught them how to design the vehicle, how to design the spacecrafts that they will have to lead into the future? So I think it's very important that we introduce into our curricula and into our universities ways to train the next generation of students to become designers of the systems that are going to exist over the next 100 years or over the long now. The university needs to work with government departments to build scenarios for the long now. The university needs to create a culture of long now. Today, we have a culture of the short now across the world, across the state, across India. Everywhere we see the culture of the short now. Unless we have a culture of the long now, we will not think about design. We will not think about the future. So the need for looking at the long now cannot be stressed. It is extremely important to look at the long now. Real transformation lies in deep and slow change. Universities create deep and slow transformation. Universities are not vehicles or magic wands to create overnight transformations. They are meant to create deep, lasting, slow transformations. The long now of Goa does not reside with the economy or the government, but it resides with the university. If education cannot design the future wisely, what is education for? Thank you.
We are now going to have a very short, brief question answer session. And we'll be sending a mic around. So if any of you have some queries, you can please address it to Dr. Saraph.
The scenarios which we create by simulation, the result must be taken with a pinch of salt, because we are designing something based on the current data. Now, by the time we design a system, the data itself will be changing, and we think that we have taken all the parameters into consideration. But in real life, it doesn't happen. Therefore, the scenario that we create out of simulation, I think its accuracy needs to be determined.
You're absolutely right. Every scenario is as good as the assumptions that go beyond in making the scenario. So whether it's based on an understanding of the systems which actually cause the particular scenario to happen, whether it's the model which is built and what made the model, whether it is data driven and what data actually caused the scenario to be created, will decide the usefulness and the utility of the scenario. However, having a set of scenarios is far better than the absence of scenarios. And it's important, therefore, to encourage the building of these scenarios, because unless you have scenarios, you will not think about design. When you have scenarios, you will think about what are the design limitations. Can we actually accomplish what we feel we want to accomplish? What visions we have, what aspirations we have? Can they actually be realized? We don't know till we don't have a scenario, till we don't make a model. So I think I don't look at scenarios as predictions. They are basically exercises to help you to come to understand what are the utopias and dystopias that we might create, or somewhere in between, and help create a dialogue, a discourse with people who are going to be affected, to allow them to choose, make choices, and choose about their decisions, choose about the purpose for which they live, choose about the visions which they aspire for, and see if they can actually live up to and enjoy the life that they will have on planet Earth. So I hope I address your question.
Sir, you spoke about designers and pilots, the one who take it to its logical conclusion. And you treat them as two separate entities. To my mind, there would necessarily be a kind of a input, basically from the people at ground level who are implementing, which the designers would have to take into consideration. The designers cannot be an isolated entity, in my opinion. This is what I've seen also from university functioning.
Well, there is always a spectrum of individuals, or there are a variety of ways in which design operates. So some design is based out of a perceived need that you see out there on the ground, and actually seeing what needs to be redesigned, you might come up with a new design. Some design can be de novo. I think one of the most well-known examples of almost a de novo design is the idea of iTunes, created by Steve Jobs. He didn't actually go and ask people or actually see how people consume. If he had actually tried to design the idea of ripping a CD album into individual songs and make them downloadable on the net, nobody would have said we want to do it. It's basically visualizing and creating a scenario. What if I designed something like this? What might happen? What might be the outcome? And doing that, there was a design which probably was not rooted in the way in which the world consumed music, but it still is something which transformed the world. It transformed the music industry. So there are different ways to design. And the interesting thing is that mostly designers today, whichever way they start designing, don't tend to have time as their x-axis. Designs tend to be static. I design something. If I make a regional plan or a town plan, I just say that this is, next 20 years this will apply. That's it. But I don't look upon it as being dynamic. There are lots of things which change over the 20 years. Is it only 20 years that I should plan for? Because, it takes 20 years to build things which are there in a regional plan. So I should probably be planning for 100 years. Unless I plan for 100 years, if you look at the old Mughal kings who planted trees on either side of their highways, or planned huge roads, or planned monuments and structures which outlived them, why did they do that? They were not planning for their lifetimes. They were not planning for today. They were looking at, the whole of generations. Why is it that we as, a society, as a civilization, have stopped creating monuments, structures, plans, designs that will outlive us? Is there a single structure that we have created that in Goa that will outlive our generation? That people will feel that we need to preserve, like the Portuguese houses or the old Goan houses that existed during the Portuguese regime. Is there any architecture? Are the flats and the apartments which are being built in Goa likely to exist 50 years from now? Would we want to live in them? Are the roads which are being widened and the trees which are being removed likely to be looked back by historians of the future as being the wise things that we did? The decisions that we make today will be the subject of historians examining and asking, did this generation ever think about the future? Did this generation ever think about us? So I think the most important input that will have to come to designers is about thinking about the future, looking at the timeline.
I had just one question and also a part of an observation. When you mentioned that universities are going to be the fountainhead for education, and education is something which is going to build the kind of scenarios that one would like to see. I think, this is my observation, I could be wrong also, there is a concept of trust and autonomy which the society should decide to deliver to universities if they want to create scenarios so that the society can take decisions. You see that happening probably in universities abroad, but do you think that happening here in the universities in this country?
Let me first correct you. I said that universities are the fountainhead of wisdom. They are the storehouse of wisdom. In a university, we can afford to think about 100 years. Like somebody sitting in a government, we don't need to think about election to election. So therefore, we are able to take the long now perspective. And therefore, we are also able to transform ourselves to going beyond being analysts to being designers. This is a role which I think universities will increasingly have to take on. If you look at the birth of the new age of departments across the world universities, take the media school for example at MIT. It comprises of people who are from practically every discipline, from medicine, sociology, history, architecture, and they are trying to look at the designs of the world in maybe today in narrow areas and not as all-encompassing, and maybe not yet looking at the dynamic aspect of it. But that is precisely what they are trying to do. And the importance of the Media Lab in MIT's future, I think, is tremendous. And in the same way, and in the same vein, I think universities in India need to take up the challenge and create at least a course on the design of future. Because if you create a course on the design of future, you will make the students and the faculty ask the question, what is it that we learn or do in this domain that affects the world out there? And can it affect the world out there in different ways than what it does today? And what will be the importance of this over the next 100 years or next 1,000 years? Because really speaking, it is not the know-how, but it's actually when should I use this? How should I use this? That is going to be the most important thing that we as teachers will be able to impart to our students. I hope I address your question.
You have rightly reminded us and in time that the future society in Goa is going to be top-heavy and that it might require a huge influx of workforce here. But already we find that the present demographic situation itself is very complex. And what I did understand is, suppose there is need for long-term planning, for the longer now, and there is need for imagination for that. Is it to be at the cost of finding immediate solutions for what we have at hand? How to have a certain kind of a balance?
Well, whenever you're looking at the long now, then essentially your focus becomes the long now. If you sit within the government, you will essentially look at what is expedient at the time. But if you sit outside the government and you have the luxury of being the fountainhead of wisdom for the state, you can actually afford to project alternative scenarios. And alternates are not binary. By virtue of saying you need to create scenarios, it means there is a whole spectrum of scenarios that will exist. It is not that one takes up positions on any of the scenarios. But what one does when you create scenarios is you project and say that here is the wide variety of options we have about the future we will live in. And the choices we make today are the ones which will decide what that future is going to be. And therefore, it becomes important for us to squarely remain on the long now. For us to remain on the long now. For those who want to be expedient will continue to be expedient. So I think we should not try to do the task of those who are the pilots. If you are driving, a car and you see another vehicle come by, you have to swerve and go past, or you have to stop before you hit, before there's a collision. But, as designers, we can say, I will design a vehicle which will make sure that this collision course will not happen. It will detect vehicles on the other side. So if I were to focus on the plight of the person who's trying to navigate the car at that point of time, I may only come up with a design of fast braking, not of avoiding the collision by ensuring they don't deviate from the path. So what questions I will ask will completely differ on, what is my perspective.
Sir, while appreciating the importance of building scenarios, it's very well discussed also today. My more concern is how and who. In the sense, I am very disturbed maybe with the speech saying that we are all living in the now, short now maybe. But who is going to be the actual drivers for a state like Goa we are talking about? And governments, you have rightly said that they are looking from elections to elections. And as academicians, we are more concerned maybe from the university perspective, not as a state. So who and how do we create these drivers? How does it actually happen? Because I sitting in my chair, I will visualize maybe. But how does that integration happen? And how do we actually start it off?
Well, every department in a university typically tends to look at some domain of the real world. Somebody from the social sciences department may be looking at the social dynamics of Goa. Somebody from management might be looking at tourism or might be looking at some other areas in Goa. Somebody from health sciences will be looking at the health issues that are likely to exist in Goa. Shifting that focus to the long now and creating scenarios or learning to create scenarios, if that capacity does not exist in that faculty, it's possible to build that capacity so that that faculty can actually create alternate scenarios for their domain over the long now. So starting there is important. And when these long now scenarios are created, engaging with those who are concerned with the short now to come to regular talks or lectures that you give on the long now of your domains is extremely important. When the decision maker looks at here and now today, if you are able to project the long now and create that creative tension will cause them to look at least a little bit further up than what they are normally used to. If you let go and say, no, I have to be practical and look at the now, then that vision of yours of looking at the long now and creating alternate scenarios will just snap back and Goa will not change. So if we want to change Goa, then I think we need to build the capacity of every faculty in the university to project scenarios for their domains, health, tourism, mining, engineering, urban planning, all of that. If we see that, an architect in Goa creates the structure that you see while coming to the university, it just says that, we need to help our architecture college to develop scenarios of what Goa will look like over the next 100 years. Somewhere we have failed to help someone to look at that. Ultimately it's some student of ours, who has gone out and created this monstrosity. And if they can even think about it for whatever reason, it means that we as teachers need to put something there that will ensure that the next 100 years our students will design a better Goa.